So long before I stepped into my first pair of mountaineering boots, I read every mountaineering book I could get my hands on, and I considered myself quite an experienced mountaineer, despite the fact that I'd never actually even tied into a rope. And that's the beauty of these books that I'm going to share with you. They really take you to that place and they get you inspired. So I'm sharing with you my 9 most inspiring and influential mountaineering books that turned me from an armchair mountaineer into, I guess I can call myself a mountaineer now. But instead of sitting by the fire with a hot chocolate like a proper armchair mountaineer, I'm going to actually go out on a little adventure and tell you the stories about these books. Now, you may have picked up on this already by my accent, but I am Australian, so this list is heavily influenced by Australian mountaineers. So hopefully, if you're not Australian, you'll pick up on some new books that you maybe haven't heard before, and if you are Australian, get amongst it. These guys are our heroes. Let's do it. So just to clear things up, an armchair mountaineer is someone who reads a lot about mountaineering but doesn't actually do any mountaineering, and that was me for a good portion of my life. Until I convinced myself that I could be a climber. So this video is about that transition. Now, you might have guessed by now that also, this is not Australia. I moved here to Spain about a year ago because there's mountains here and there is nothing in Australia. Didn't stop a lot of really strong climbers getting to the summits of some big mountains though. But not all these books were written by Australians. The first one is certainly not. So first cab off the rank is Climb by Anatoli Boukreev. Anatoli was a climber from Kazakhstan who is best known for his role as a guide in the 1996 Everest disaster scenario, when on more than one occasion he went out into a blizzard above 8,000 meters above sea level to rescue stranded climbers successfully. He did this after having climbed Everest without supplementary oxygen, something that earned him some criticism and kind of led to him being portrayed as the bad guy in John Krakaur's Into Thin Air, in a kind of token Russian Bond villain kind of way, to be honest, which is ironic because by all accounts he was this incredibly caring and thoughtful nice guy, kind of like a gentle giant. It's pretty clear that Anatoly is one of the strongest and most capable mountaineers ever, perhaps thanks to his Soviet-era approach to training and acclimatization, which he details in his book. The climb tells quite a different perspective on the 96 Everest disaster, but also provides some insider commentary on both commercial mountaineering and on life as a climber in general. Unfortunately, not long after the book was released, Anatoly died in an avalanche on Annapurna in December 1997. Okay, we're at the trailhead. Can't park the car here because last time I left my car up here, it got attacked by a bunch of wild horses. Savage beasts. True story. Alright. Anyway, second book that got me out of my armchair mountaineer phase, Shewill by Groom. Mike Groom is a highly accomplished Australian mountaineer, having climbed the 5 highest mountains in the world without bottled oxygen. Whilst he was also a guide in the 96 Everest disaster, the book seems to avoid that topic, which is pretty typical of Mike's character. He tends to avoid drama and anything that's not really worth talking about. Shewill is so much more than another recap of events on Everest. Instead, it's a classic triumph over adversity story which details most of his life. The turning point of which was his climb of Kanchenjunga, where he suffered terrible frostbite to his feet, which resulted in most of his feet being amputated.
But this black mark here represents the frostbite that I received in the last few days.
In Shewill, Mike shares his story of how he picked himself up out of that physical disability and how he overcame this mental prison he found himself in after Kanchenjunga. Not to flex too hard on you guys, but I know Mike well. He's from my hometown. We've both tried and failed to climb Annapurna together a few years ago, and I often forget that he still climbs really difficult routes without feet, essentially. So if you've got excuses why you're not climbing, this book should take care of most of those. Book number 3 that got me out of the chair and into the trail was Into Thin Air by John Krakaur. Another book about the Everest disaster, and the last one on this list. I've included this book because it's just so gripping, it's so well written, and it's really the ultimate armchair mountaineer's book. It's allowed hundreds of thousands of people around the world to form an opinion on something they really know nothing about, and it brings into question the act of mountaineering itself, which I think is an important question to address. This book was also adapted into a movie. I haven't seen it, but after a quick scan through, seems like the cheesiest mountaineering movie of all time.
Oh God, too many climbers.
I think if you've got aspirations for big mountains, I would say that this book is mandatory reading. That's Into Thin Air. Book number 4, Summit 8000 by Andrew Locke. Andrew is another highly accomplished Australian mountaineer, and in this book he details his ultimately successful journey in becoming the first Australian to climb all 14 8,000 metre peaks. That's a Himalayan Grand Slam. Pretty impressive given Australia's lack of not only mountains but any kind of interest or supportive culture when it comes to mountaineering. For me, the most outstanding component of the book was Andrew's completely uncompromising approach to achieving his goal. This is the most hard-headed example of pursuing a goal that I've ever read. I mean, he prioritised mountaineering over absolutely everything else. You see this guy sacrifice love, his job, his entire personal life in order to reach this goal. Perhaps not the best example of a balanced life, but if you're looking for something so brutal and honest and raw to the point that it's inspiring, then this is probably the book for you. Well worth reading. Book number 5, Annapurna by Maurice, Herzog. This is just one of those books that needs to be included in every list of books about mountaineering simply because of its existence. It details the first successful ascent of an 8,000 metre peak, which was Annapurna. And ironically, that's now considered one of the most difficult mountains in the world, and after reading this book, you'll understand why. At the time, Annapurna was completely unsurveyed. They were going in with these sketchy maps with no detail at all. They were following no one else's route. I mean, in rock climbing terms, they literally on-sighted Annapurna. But of course, not all success. I mean, this book details some of the most horrifying aspects of mountaineering, and in fact, it's a book that might keep you firmly planted with your ass on the couch forever, but luckily for us, it's not 1950, and things, thankfully, just aren't this hard anymore. So if you're a mountaineer, you should understand the struggles of those who came before us, and that's what this book does. Book number 6, 7 Years in Tibet by Heinrich Harrer. Now a major motion picture starring heartthrob Brad Pitt. This is the true story of an Austrian climber who in 1939 set off with the intention of climbing Nanga Parbat. However, on the outbreak of World War II, he's captured by the British and becomes a prisoner of war. The story details his various escape attempts from prison and eventually his time living in and falling in love with Tibet, its culture and its people. Whilst the book isn't really about mountaineering, it does tell the true story of Tibet and its Chinese occupation. It's probably the finest introduction a Westerner can have into that undeniable connection between spirituality and mountaineering that so many of us have trouble comprehending, myself included. If you're planning to go to the Himalayas, I think that understanding the bare minimum about the culture and some of the philosophies of the people who live their entire lives above 10,000 feet is something that's only going to enrich your experience, and 7 Years in Tibet does that. Of course, you can watch the movie, but as always, the book has far more detail. Book number 7 is Everest from Sea to Summit by Tim Macartney-Snape. This is a story of high adventure that goes far beyond climbing and mountaineering. It's perhaps the most adventurous idea that anyone could think up. I mean, the principle of climbing every single metre of the highest mountain in the world from sea level, especially when it requires walking all the way through India, is fairly bold, in my opinion. When I read it initially, I was travelling through India at the time, and it certainly gave me the perspective that I needed just to deal with everyday life in India for 3 months. But in this book, Tim really displays a very pragmatic, problem-solving attitude, which is super important as a quality for a mountaineer to have. On his prior attempt on Everest, for example, Tim somehow misplaced his mountaineering boots along the way, but rather than calling the trip failure and going home, he instead decided the trip wasn't over. He continued in his ski boots and he made the summit and back becoming the first Australian to climb Mount Everest, all without bottled oxygen. I mean, I'm a certified fanboy at this point. Book number 8 is Touching the Void by Joe Simpson. This is a phenomenal survival story which details the events of 2 British climbers attempting Shewill Grande, a 6,000 metre peak in the Peruvian Andes. I don't want to give too much away. I'm sure you've come across this book already, but if you haven't, it's an absolute must read. If I ever ended up in some horrific survival situation, I'll be remembering this story and it will be pushing me and reminding me not to give up. This book was later turned into a documentary which played at least once a year on Australian TV, and it's probably the reason why I was so interested in adventures and mountaineering as a kid in the first place. It's a great doco, but as always, you got to read the book to get the full story. Highly recommended. Book number 9 is The View from the Summit by Sir Edmund Hillary. One of the first 2 men to stand on the summit of Mount Everest along with his climbing partner Tenzing Norgay. This is more old school, required reading, not only if you're a mountaineer, but also if you're just going trekking to, say, to Everest Base Camp. This is a great book to read. Again, this is a book written by a Westerner that gives a great insight into the culture of the Sherpa people. This book is Hillary's life story, but it's much less about the mountain than it is about the story of the mountains and the Sherpa people completely capturing him, which, if you've been to Nepal, you can probably relate to. So if you are going to Nepal or the Himalayas, especially to climb, you'll really benefit from reading this book on so many levels. Book number 10 is my all-time favourite. It's called White Limbo by Lincoln Hall. White Limbo is the name of an as yet unrepeated route on the northern side of Everest, which was achieved without bottled oxygen and barely any expedition support. The book of the same name tells the story of the team that established the route, who successfully summited and became the first Australian team to do so. Look, I'm not much of a nationalist, but this story makes me proud to be an Australian mountaineer, not only because of the bleak situation that Australian mountaineers are faced with and at home in terms of lack of mountains, but mainly because these guys climbed Everest in impeccable style and they surmounted every obstacle that was thrown their way, which was a lot of them. If you'll read the book, you'll find out. I think it is this combination of Lincoln being both a professional writer and an exceptionally accomplished mountaineer that's led to the book being so honest, so gripping, and so heartbreaking that you can't put it down. You could easily read this in a weekend. I'm obviously biased given that I'm Australian. I'm sure I'm not the only one who can resonate with the challenges of being completely in love with the mountains and living in a space that doesn't really provide that for you. So if you're watching this channel, maybe you're in that situation as well. And if I'm your weekly source of mountain-related content on YouTube, then I'm stoked that I can keep you informed and in shape for the mountains. So thanks for following along. So I was kind of planning on continuing this list whilst climbing this thing. And I was thinking on the way up here, there's some really, really terrible mountaineering movies.